A phaser is an interesting effect that can add some serious dimension to the textures in your music, but sometimes it can be tough to figure out exactly what situations to use it in. So today we're going to go over 5 of my favorite practical situations where reaching for a phaser is a very good choice. Let's jump in. Now, essentially the way a phaser works is it takes your source signal, duplicates it, and then applies what are called all-pass filters to change the phase relationship of certain parts of the frequency spectrum, which when combined with the original signal creates all these really cool sounding notches in the frequency spectrum. Now, just as a general guideline, I think it's best to use a phaser on sounds that are consistent in level and also something that has a lot of harmonics that fills out the frequency spectrum as much as possible. It's just a lot less noticeable on short and kind of narrow banded sounds. One of my all-time favorite ways of using a phaser is actually to change the tonality of a bass sound and sometimes use it in combination with some automation. So if we had like a little synth bass line that sounded like this, and it sounds, fine as it is, but we can spice it up a lot just using a phaser alone. So you can see that there are basically 3 notches that have been created, and we can increase that or decrease that to change the sound. So let's play around with this a little bit. Already you can hear that it's really made a big difference to the tone of the bass. Now what I like to do is stick to a lower number of notches, and we're just going to change the center frequency of where the notches are located to change the tone of our bass here. So that's a little bit more subtle, but if we decrease the spread and increase the feedback where the output gets fed back into the input for some more extreme versions of the phaser, like let's increase this to about 50% and move the center frequency again. We can also make the spread a little bit higher and increase the notches to 4 or 5. Now you can also imagine too that this gets really crazy when you want to get even more creative with the tone. So you could even use the original tone and kind of blend the phaser in and out using the dry wet knob. So if I just create a little bit of automation here. So if you're doing a little bit more creative work, I like to make use of the LFO. But if you're just doing some tonal work, I like to bring the amount for the LFO all the way down and just kind of change the center frequency until you get some different tonal options and you find something that you like. The next of my favorite ways to use a flanger is to make certain sounds come alive. Some of the sounds that we use can, be a little bit on the boring side, and a phaser can be a nice way to add some life to it. So if we had like a little pad like this, so, it's kind of a cool sound, but it's, it needs a little bit of work here. So if we throw on a phaser, and I have the notches set at about 3 here, one cool thing is if you keep the spread relatively high and you increase the amount and just kind of have a slow swirling with the LFO, it changes the left and right phase relationships and kind of swirls around in the stereo image. So if you listen on headphones, you can hear this even better. And of course, we can increase the notches and change the center frequency. And if you want it to be a little bit crazier, you can increase the rate a little bit. I like to think of these notches as kind of like ridges. So the higher number of notches there are, the more ridgy it sounds, right? Like it's wavy. So I like to keep the notches relatively low, just kind of helping, swirl in and out of the stereo image. One other thing that's nice about this too is it adds interest to the stereo image, but it also gives a little bit more room for some of the stuff that's in the center, like a vocal might be, or the bass or the drums or whatever. My next favorite way of using a phaser is actually on some drums, but in particular, I really like how they sound on hi-hats, or hi-hat loops in this case. So if you have a kick and a snare and, a hi-hat loop on top of those two things, and it just sounded like this. So, really nothing special at all. What you can do is throw on a phaser on top of the hi-hat loop specifically, and it'll start to sound like this. So all I'm really doing is doing another kind of swirling. There's a few more notches here. So there's actually 5 notches in this case, but it's kind of a slow swirling sound like we were doing before. But I've got the feedback up so we can hear some of the resonances of the notches that are created by the phaser. And we've also actually got the LFO going. And so it's kind of, again, slowly swirling, and you can play around with where you put this center frequency. But if you think about a hat, it's going to be concentrated in the upper frequency range, so that's kind of where you would want your center frequency to be. So if you're feeling like your drum loop is just a little on the stale side, try this with your hats. And it works best if they're not like really closed and tight hats. This hat loop is a little bit looser. And again, it's a little bit more full spectrum than, something like a trap hat might be. So it's kind of a good choice for the phaser in this scenario. One of my all-time favorite uses for a phaser is actually on vocal tracks, but not necessarily the raw vocals, but I prefer to do it on the return tracks or the aux tracks, whatever you're using for your effects. A lot of people, would use like a reverb or a delay send. In this case, let's say that we're working with a vocal like this.
I told you once, baby, I told you once what I know. You got to let it go. I told you once, baby.
So let's say that we wanted to add some delay to that, and we're using a return track for that. Or in this case, a send, right? I'm going to send everything to send A here. And if we pull up and send A, all I've got set up is a very simple delay. And so this is what it would sound like, maybe in a particular song.
I told you once, baby, I told you once what I know. You got to let it go. I told you once, baby.
And that's all well and good, but if these are the delays that we like in the particular song that we're doing, it can make the center of the mix sound a little bit crowded. And so what I like to do is add a phaser after the delay to kind of help spread out the delays in a pleasing way to make room for the main vocal in the center. So this is what it would sound like.
I told you once, baby, I told you once what I know. You got to let it go. I told you once, baby.
We're just using 4 notches, and it's a real slow kind of swirl to smear the vocal delays around in the stereo image and make it more interesting for the listener, but also carve out some room for those important elements in the center. I've even seen people get really creative with using this on reverb as well, not just delays. So if you had some reverb like this and,
I told you once, baby, I told you once what I know. You got to let it go. I told you once, baby.
So it adds some really cool flavor to certain effects. So definitely try it out on your return tracks as well. You can come up with some really wild sounding stuff. Now, the last of my all-time favorite ways of using a phaser is actually on the master bus of the beat or the song that you're working on. Because I like to apply the phaser to certain sections to add some variation. And in particular, there's a couple that I think work really well. One of them is a pre-chorus where, all the instruments drop out and you're kind of setting up the chorus. And it could be a really cool way of maybe when the pre comes back the second time, you just add in this little variation of a phaser on top of basically everything except for the vocals. And then also another one that works really well is the outro. So let's go ahead and take a little listen to an example here of where you could add this and add some flavor to your music. So this would be kind of like the verse, and then the pre-chorus is coming up here. And then it drops out for the chorus. Another thing that you can do too is you can add in a little tiny variation at the end of a phrase. So like in the hook here, like maybe you want to do something like this. Just a little bit of ear candy for the listener. That's all we're doing. And then, again, like an outro might be like, say you're in the last hook and you want to kind of finish out the song with a bang or with some variation, right? So this is what you do. So I hope my favorite ways of using phasers has given you guys some interesting ways that you can incorporate phasers into your own music. And I, in general, tend to like them a little bit more than flangers because you can be more subtle, but you can also be really crazy with them in terms of like a sound design context as well. But let me know down in the comments below which was your favorite use for the phasers and how you use them in your own music already. And until the next video, happy music making, and we'll see you very soon. Take care. Peace.